hopefully if you're creating videos that are really geared towards social discovery, this type of campaign can really get you unstuck in making, something that felt like it didn't work out super well, and give it legs, give it traffic. And then hopefully that starts to gear you towards doing more content that is specifically built for discovery.
You are now listening to the Creative Juice podcast, brought to you by IndiePRO.io.
What's up, Indies? Welcome back to Creative Juice. This is episode 223. I am your host, Jack McCarthy. With me today is your co-pilot, Ed Isola, and we're going to be talking about getting unstuck with fan-base growth. Ed, what is up, my dude?
Yo, I feel like this is going to be a great episode for anybody and everybody that's listening, because this is something that I've experienced early on in my career, middle to date. Like, it feels like a lot of times things operate in cycles, especially with top of funnel, where it's like, oh, I've got this video, now I'm running top of funnel and it went viral, or it's getting a great cost per view, and all these things are like working for you. And then you kind of taper off and are like, dang, now I'm stuck. What do I do next? And so this is gonna be really cool, because it's something that I think that I didn't realize early on, but now when I am stuck, I'm like, oh, here's the things that I need to do. And it kind of gives you a constant lifeline. So I'm pumped to dive into it.
I'm pumped to dive into this too. And I think that that's a really good point, that a lot of the frameworks that we're going to talk about and the strategies that we're going to talk about today, they fit for artists that are just trying to build a fan base for the very first time, but it's also very applicable to artists that have a burgeoning fan base that's continuing to grow, and maybe they just need to get new music out there for the first time, or maybe they've been quiet for a little bit and they're trying to kick things back into high gear. I think all three of those kind of scenarios are conversations that we have at the agency all the time with clients, or with clients that we're talking to about getting involved with. That happens a lot. And, we spent the last few episodes on the show talking about how paid traffic and organic traffic are kind of like two pieces of your fan growth engines. I hope that this episode now kind of serves as if you're feeling stuck, we're going to help you get unstuck sort of kickoff here, because we talked a lot of theory around advertising and organic growth. Hopefully this will be actionable stuff that can be put into place pretty quickly, depending on what your goals are. So for the purpose of this episode, Ed, and tell me to shut up if you think that this is out of touch, but what I think we should do is let's break down different types of campaigns, ad campaigns that you can run for growing an audience, for putting people into a mode of discovery, and break those down by platform and talk about, the pros and cons of each, what you need for them, and also what you should have in your mind as far as like setting an expectation and a goal. Because I think for running Instagram Reels traffic, for example, your goals and what you should be setting yourself up for are different than what you would be expecting running fan finder traffic on Facebook, for example, or on YouTube. So I think that that'll be a good framework for us to kind of pick apart. Let's kick it off.
Dude, I think that you're spot on, and I love the idea of going through the different options. And I also love actionable episodes. So like Jack said, I think this will be a great one. I would probably recommend listening through it, and then listening through it, getting the sense of what the different options are, and where, like Jack said, what's your objective? Which one makes sense? So here are all the options, and then you can just rewind, go back to the section specifically that you want to implement. But it's probably a great one to have earmarked too for the future, because it's kind of it's going to be like a timeless kind of take on here's what you do when you're stuck. So I love it. Shall we kick off with Instagram Reels?
Let's do it.
All right. Well, I will start, I guess. So Instagram Reels has become, I would say, my personal favorite. And I would say also one of the favorites at the company as a whole, both IndieX and IndiePRO, the team. And there's a couple reasons. One, I think if you're looking for, like Jack said, hey, what is the objective with Instagram Reels? I think that Instagram Reels are a really, really great way to drive traffic to your streaming platform, specifically Spotify. And so it's the best way that we have to drive traffic in a super controllable manner to Spotify to grow your followers and your streams and your listeners. And also you see a side benefit of Instagram followers going up. So it's a really great one for those reasons, because it's like, I know that Spotify is always a goal for a lot of artists listening. And if you're dead set on it, this is, to me, the best way to do that, while also creating tons of warm audience on Instagram that you can retarget later on.
Yeah, I think that this is a really good traffic placement to start off with, because right now, I think user experience and just general use of social platforms for music fans is very tailored to short form vertical content. So Reels, kind of came on the back of TikTok becoming so popular, and we've seen that translate really well to advertising. So yeah, I think IG Reels is a great one to start with from the perspective of helping to drive new listener growth over to streaming like Spotify or Apple Music. I think it's worth mentioning in this point, as kind of like a secondary, is IG stories and utilizing those same sorts of creatives, maybe slightly more geared towards feeling native to stories. But stories is also still a solid placement to use, maybe a little saturated more than they were a few years back. But I think those two go hand in hand for sure.
Yeah, and it's cool because, like you said, Reels and stories really, they can share creative for the most part. So I think that's great. And I think that kind of gives you an outline of like, what should your objective be, or you should do Instagram Reels and stories if, you want to grow streaming or grow Instagram followers. So I think that's really good. That's probably the pros too. I guess, what cons do you see, Jack, in using Instagram Reels and stories?
I think some of the cons with short form content in general, in my opinion, is that new listeners that are discovering you through this right out the gate, they don't have a whole lot of content to really latch on to you with. So one thing to keep in mind is that you might not be getting the most, I hesitate to use the word qualified listener or fan here, but that's kind of the first thing that comes to my mind, is people might be discovering you and they might be digging what you do, but they may not be ready to go, full force into being a fan where they're going to continue to listen, or they're going to be ready to opt into something or buy. So there's probably some more work to be done on the education and nurturing stages of your buddy system once you pull those people into your world. So what I mean to say in all of that is, from an actionable point of view, when you're running this kind of traffic, you need to make sure that you're an artist that is actively out there being an artist and you're posting content. This is really where like the organic leg comes into play, in my opinion. You need to make sure that that's going on, because if you're just running traffic on Reels or on stories and trying to drive listenership and that's sort of it, I think you're more likely to be forgotten about than with longer form video.
That's a really good point. And I think that these are cons, right? But I think they're less like, here's reasons why you shouldn't do it, and more reasons and things that you should be aware of in order to do it properly.
100%. I couldn't agree more.
Yeah. So I guess I said con, but I wanted to clarify that. But absolutely, the content thing, like, you got to think about the way that the Reels and stories are working, right? Everybody knows, presumably knows what Reels and stories are. And so people are either going to click on the link and go visit the off Instagram website, so Spotify or whatever in this instance. They're going to go visit that. And if they're there, they're going to judge you based solely off of what your streaming platform looks like. So you got to make sure that that's up to date. Keep updated artist picks, right? Like all that stuff. Make sure it seems cool and fresh. And like, you have a banner photo, you have maybe an artist playlist, you have a pinned track, like you have a bio, you have photos. You got to make sure that looks good. And if they don't go to that, and they engage with your posts, they're clicking over to your bio, most likely. And that's, to Jack's point, you got to have consistent posting and recurring content. Even if that's like 1 or 2 posts a week, nobody wants to click over and see a dead profile, because it just would be like, why am I interested in this? So I think that's one thing to be set up for and make sure before you run Reels. The other thing is that, like Jack said, it doesn't necessarily set you up for later in the funnel. I feel like a lot of times if you're running, some of these other campaigns we'll get into, like Facebook feed or Instagram feed, that's intended to say, hey, watch this 2-minute video, and then I'm going to come back with more content later. Reels is like a 15-second video max. And you're really going after like somebody that you catch their eye and say, whoa, that's a cool video. Sounds cool. Let me go stream. You're not really setting yourself up to play the long game. So that's just making sure you have that kind of framework with how you're thinking about it.
To your point there, I think a consideration to make with that is that when you're running this kind of traffic, you're likely going to need more touches, more interactions with people, more at bats to really get somebody to go from, a cold new listener to somebody who's actually interested in being a fan,
Yeah.
So looking and driving up frequency is probably something that's important. And that involves, spending money over time, which I think is an important consideration to make when it comes to things like budget.
Yeah, absolutely. And on the budget note too, I was kind of thinking like reels and stories can get expensive very quickly if you don't have your creative or your audience dialed in. So to me,
spot on.
It feels like a place to not necessarily listen to this and be like, hey, I'm just starting. I'm going to start here. It feels like kind of a secondary step when you have run some other campaigns and you say, hey, okay, I understand who my best audiences are. I know who my best headlines are, my best videos. Like, let me trim that and try it now. If you just jump in cold and you start testing on reels, like you're probably going to see very high cost per click and very high cost per follower and not much impact. So just make sure you have your creative and everything dialed in before you jump into this. It could be your first campaign. Just you want to make sure you really, really know what you're doing when you're doing this, because otherwise you can go south pretty quickly.
I think that's a really good point, and maybe this is a useful place in this kind of like exploratory to touch on like the things that you would need for any of these campaigns is you're going to need video content, and it's going to need to be video content that is really geared towards social discovery. And you're going to need to figure out if you can have vertical versions of that and horizontal versions of that, short form and long form. And then you're going to need to have copy that you write that is in place to be headlines or to be captions on the video itself for the advertising. So those are like the big three things that you're going to need from a creative perspective: is a great video, a really solid performance video that catches people's attention. You're going to need clips of that video, a variety of versions of that video to fit each of these placements, and then you're going to need copy. Those are kind of like I would say the prerequisites, like you were saying, Ed. And if you can test those out ahead of time and really dial in what exactly it is you want to be putting out there, I think that that's going to serve you well. And ideally, like in some of these cases, which we'll get into in a second when it comes to TikTok, is like sometimes organic can work as your testing ground, which is cool. But those are the assets you're going to need. In terms of exploring that, I'll leave a link in the show notes to IndiePRO. If you want to learn how to build these campaigns, but more importantly, build the right kinds of video for them, the Fan Finder Method training is the one to study and learn and implement. So I'll leave a link to IndiePRO. You can get access to the Fan Finder training inside of the IndiePRO library. I highly, highly recommend digging into that. But getting back on the topic of campaigns, I guess IG feed or feed campaigns in general, IG feed, Facebook feed, news feed campaigns are probably the next one to talk about.
Dude, absolutely. And just to circle back to the training real quick, I think that's really cool because we just updated it and it goes through specifically, like, here's what works on Reels, here's what works on this. Like, here's the different types of creative you should make per platform. And that's something that wasn't in there currently. So, I just got a lot of value out of that via testing and going through it myself. And it's like, it's very clarifying on what kind of videos you should and shouldn't be doing for different platforms. It maybe isn't intuitive at first glance, but yeah. So number 2, that kind of sums up Reels, like Jack said. Number 2 is Instagram feeds and Facebook feeds. And my thoughts on this are that if you've never run a campaign, this is where you can kind of start. You can start here and you can generate more awareness and more relationships with your fans. Reels, we're talking about 15-second clips. If you're running on Instagram feed, Facebook feed, you want to be going for like that 2 to 3 minute video. I think Instagram caps you at 2 minutes and Facebook doesn't have a cap. But it serves as the first entry point, the first touch point to a new fan to say, hey, watch this entire thing. And that's where you start to see, oh, somebody watches 2 minutes of this 2-minute video. They're probably interested. I'll show them another ad. So this is something that I always recommend to artists that are starting out. Also works really well if you have a new single or something like that you want to push with a video, and you just spend a bunch of money or whatever you have budgeted on this, and it gets it. Yeah, it gets it. I mean, you can spend $500 on it. That you'll see a lot of results from that, but it gets it in front of people, both warm and cold audience, both people that know you and people that don't. That it's kind of a great default if you're stuck and say, okay, let me do a new fan finder video. Let me put some money behind it on Facebook feed. And from there, you start to lay the platform of what's working, what's not, and that trickles into reels down the line. And it's kind of on a per video basis, which is cool.
Yeah, I agree with you on that. Something I want to add here is if your intention, and it probably should be some of your intention at some point in your music marketing stack as far as audience growth goes, if your intention is to try and qualify new fans, in-feed ads like running a fan finder on IG or on a Facebook news feed is a really good way to do that, because the social interaction that you see in terms of comments and shares and reactions is usually the sort of qualitative stuff that you can look at outside of just, cost per video view or cost per click. And I think that that's really important, especially at the very beginning when you're testing how strong a video asset actually really is to get that kind of feedback from your fans and potential fans, new fans that are coming in. So that's a really strong one. If you've got a great video that, is a full length sort of video, feed ads like that are really, really powerful, and they can be very, very affordable still to this day. So yeah, I think we covered feed pretty well here and kind of like what the expectation should be. I think it's a really good opportunity, like you said, Ed, to be a testing ground. It's something that can happen across multiple releases. It works well if you gear your music videos towards this kind of content. It allows you a place to, kind of maximize their effectiveness, I think.
It absolutely does. And those are all awesome points. And it's like the maximization of effectiveness. I hesitate to say like that's the biggest benefit of running these campaigns, because someone listening, it's like, hey, I might just be starting, right? They maybe don't care about that. But to me, it is the biggest benefit, because once you get past that first campaign and that first rush of like everybody's leaving positive comments and watching the video and all the likes are coming in, like that is awesome. But once you get past that, then you start to realize, hey, I can do this on a repeated basis going forward with similar videos for different songs. And that's where the maximization of effectiveness, I think, is really cool. And if you get in the weeds and start to build these campaigns yourself, you start to see what works and what doesn't work. And then you can kind of start to tailor content to audiences and all this kind of cool stuff where it's like, it builds on itself, right? It's like a building block little by little with these campaigns. I just think that's a kind of an important observation, that like you will see a lot of top of funnel success with this. Like that's, like I said, I've done this for myself and for IndieX clients so many times. But what's the secondary value is that you start to understand who your fans really are.
Yeah, totally. And I think kind of expanding upon that a little bit is it allows you to make use of, maybe a music video that kind of fell flat on its face when you tried to just post it and get it out there for the first time. Hopefully, if you're creating videos that are really geared towards social discovery, this type of campaign can really get you unstuck in making, something that felt like it didn't work out super well, and give it legs, give it traffic. And then hopefully that starts to gear you towards doing more content that is specifically built for discovery. We've talked about that plenty, like the right kind of content to use in your ads. I think once you do it once, you start to think like, all of my music videos should probably be like this. And you and I have discussed like the value of like more narrative, quote unquote, like official music videos. We talked about that a few episodes back, and we can link to that in the show notes if you haven't heard it. But if you start to gear your release videos more towards this kind of content, it just gives you a lot of ammunition to work with and gives you a lot of ways to make those videos do something for you and reach fans, both new and current, in a new and kind of exciting way. So I think that's really important. And this kind of leads nicely, I think, into YouTube, which is, Google ads placed on YouTube are always an interesting subject to talk about with artists. I think if your goal is to try and build a YouTube audience or grow social proof on a video using Google ads placed on YouTube, then running pre-roll ads on YouTube videos is a good strategy to do that. I don't think that it's the only thing that you should have in your audience growth stack, but I do understand that a lot of artists and bands have that as a goal, is to try and, grow a following that way and build up awareness on a video that way. So I think that kind of campaign can do very well. I want to lead with a very important note here, is that the type of video that you run is in some ways even more important when you're using an interruptive source placement like YouTube, and specifically pre-roll, as your placement for these ads, because you have to capture people's attention real quick. So long, drawn out introductions, not a good video to use in a YouTube ads sort of placement. I would call that like a con and a caution.
Dude, it's interesting because I think that's true. I've run a couple YouTube campaigns, but I haven't run that many. So with all due respect, I kind of take your word for it.
Yeah, for sure. And I appreciate that. Often we see YouTube ads be more expensive, and they don't necessarily translate over to the social interaction on YouTube that a lot of artists would like to see. That said, it can be really valuable for driving up the viewer count and the listener count on a video, especially if that video is highly engaging right out the gate. I mean, it's something that really catches people's attention. Let's say you have a video that has an artist featured in it that you know their fans are going to be into it. That's the kind of thing where highlighting them with you in the, in the first scene, the first shot, that can be really, really effective for getting in front of an audience that will immediately recognize who they are and what you're trying to do, and pick up on your music. But I think that kind of campaign can be really strong if YouTube is YouTube growth is your goal. I think that it's worth running in tandem with ads on other social platforms, whether that be feeds on Facebook and IG, which are usually much more affordable in terms of cost per impressions, or vertical videos on Reels or Stories. But yeah, I think that is at least something worth considering. And like I said, we go into the setup of that, setting up Google Ads pointed towards YouTube as pre-roll ads inside of the Fan Finder method training. So worth digging into for sure if that's your goal. Again, like taking into account what kind of video you are making. I think you have to think about YouTube ads as a placement even more when you're planning out a video.
Yeah, I think the other interesting thing too is, like, first off, you're right. You do have to think about it and be really intentional. Like, I think the challenge with YouTube ads sometimes is if your creative isn't super dialed in, like, people are going to watch a different video already. So half the time I'm just watching the bottom right-hand corner of the screen for the skip ad button to go watch the video that I wanted to watch. So it's got to be really engaging. So I think that's where, if you're like an expert at pattern interrupts, it might be a good spot, but like, it really does have to catch attention. The other thing too, I really like your comment about run it in tandem with other things, because I think it helps you build subscribers. I think it helps you build views. I think what sometimes lacks from YouTube ads is the fan engagement. It's not as easy for somebody to DM you or something like that after, like as it is on Facebook and Instagram, where someone likes a song on Instagram, they DM me, and we're now having a conversation. That's harder on YouTube. So if you do, you really, really need to monitor the comments on the video and try to respond to those in a conversational tone, because you still want to be having this relationship and creating this relationship. And that is sometimes a challenge a little bit on YouTube.
Well said. I think that's a good point. And that's why it is helpful to run these in tandem. I think that's worth saying in like all of these top of funnel ad campaign structures that we're talking about, is that none of these really should exist in a vacuum, in my opinion. Like, you should be testing and trying these out. You can certainly select the ones that you want to be focusing more budget on and that fit your creative. But I think all of them have their place and are worth, exploring. And there are many of them that are worth and should be run together. So yeah, that's a really good point. The last one that we want to talk about here is TikTok. And TikTok ads are still, a growing, evolving sort of platform and space. And we've touched on this before on the show, but I think why I wanted to mention this today in tandem with what we talked about organic and paid traffic being, the engines of your fan base growth, is if you have success on TikTok organically, running traffic to successful TikTok posts is incredibly effective for continuing that traction.
Yeah. As you were talking, I wrote a note down. It said, TikTok feels like the solution when something was working, but it isn't now. And by that, I mean...
Oh, that's interesting.
Like by that, I mean, I guess point one is this. If you have a post on TikTok that's working really well, it serves as a great way to say, let's put gas on the fire and let's keep it going.
I was going to use that exact phrase.
Yeah. I think you probably said it to me at some point, honestly. But so yeah, like Jack said, option one for TikTok is like, if something pops off there, just like a glorified green light warmth type of thing, and just spend on it. To me, where in the context of this episode, where the other interesting thing is, it's like, if you do the Facebook feed or Instagram feed and this particular video is working really well, and then you trim it down into a 15-second clip, and now you're running ads from Reels to Spotify, and that's working really well. And this is all going on for a couple weeks, a month, 2 months, however long it's working. And then all of a sudden things start getting really expensive and they start going up in cost and you're not seeing the same amount of followers and there's fatigue. To me, that's where TikTok's really interesting, because then it's like, well, this thing did work, right? Like it did work for a very long time at a good amount of spend. So it's not the creative problem, it's an audience problem. That's where it's cool to me to say, hey, let's put this on TikTok. One, you should post that video on TikTok, but two, like post it, see if it catches on, and then kind of put the ad spend behind it, and you unlock this whole new top of funnel flow, audience flow, whatever you want to call it. So that's kind of where TikTok, that's how it plays into this system in my mind. It's not like step one, it's kind of like step 4.
Yeah, I agree with you. I mean, I think that's an interesting philosophy, even when it comes to organic, like you were saying. I think TikTok definitely has pros and cons. Like, it's great for putting gas on the fire of something that's working. That's a definite pro. Obviously, TikTok organically is a fantastic discovery platform. Some of the drawbacks of TikTok from an advertising perspective, I think if you're going straight to TikTok ads with a video that hasn't had any organic traction, you might see signals that it's performing okay from a cost per click or a cost per view standpoint, but it's very rare in my experience thus far to see that really allow for any like substantive growth that continues and is really something that you can qualify with excited fans. It's most often the TikTok ads work well with a piece of content that's organically already going viral, like you said, Ed. I think that's point number one to make as far as a consideration for when and when not to use TikTok ads. And also, TikTok ads obviously still is very broad when it comes to the type of targeting that you can do. And there's going to be more and more of that, and it's going to be expanded upon, and that's great. But I think you have to think differently about your video and the content that you're putting together, and probably learn a bit about the platform and what people are doing on it before you try to target with it. I think that's definitely an important point to consider as well.
Yeah, definitely. So I think maybe as like a cool wrap up, this is how I view these things in terms of where to implement if you're just starting out. I would say run Instagram feed, Facebook feed. Once you have something that's working there, trim that into a handful of different reels to Spotify. Test all those different 15-second creatives and find one that's working. Once you find one of those things that's working, try it on TikTok. If something catches on, then run that traffic. And that kind of ties those three together that we've talked about. And then YouTube, to me, is running alongside it at its own separate budget and just kind of monitoring how it's working. So that would be my recommendation for like grassroots artists. For more affirmation level artists, if you already have a following, you probably can go right to Reels and feed at the same time with your best guess as to what creative is going to work.
I like that approach for sure. I think my approach would be pretty similar, maybe slightly different, in that I would take, at a grassroots level, if you're just starting out and you're trying to get unstuck, maybe I would go towards feeds and Reels stories at the same time. But that's like if you're being ambitious with budget, obviously. But I think that would be my approach. But the rest of the way, I would totally agree with you. So there you have it, gang. I think you have some really great frameworks to work with in terms of getting yourself unstuck from an audience growth perspective with ads. And you can do this affordably. You can set aside a certain amount of budget that you want to spend. And that allows you to really tap into this at your own pace, which I think is something that we didn't mention throughout the episode, but you can get into this at your own pace, which will definitively be faster than whatever pace you're currently stuck at. So I think that that's worth saying. I hope you guys take some of these strategies and put them into place if you're feeling like your audience just isn't growing. So take these strategies, take these ad frameworks, use them, think about the videos that you've created and the copy that you might use to pull people in, depending on the placement that you're running with, and go get some new fans, Indies. I'll catch you next time on Creative Juice. Peace out.